All right, hey everyone. Just wanted to quickly go over the table in the assignment that you started yesterday. We'll talk about that and then also add some clarity to some of the topics that are covered in the reading, as well as the questions that you need to answer in the assignment today. All right, so let's get started. So if we scroll down here to the answers, to the table, you can see I've already got it filled in here. The four columns are trial notes, juvenile courts, court of appeals, and the Georgia Supreme Court. Before we dive into all this, I want to quickly talk about the difference between a trial court and an appellate court. So a trial court is probably the type of court that you're the most familiar with. It is where you go for like a traffic ticket. It was where you go if you murder somebody, all right? Trial courts are largely there to determine guilt or innocence. Okay, so what is a trial? So one of the unique characteristics of a trial court usually is that it has a jury. So a jury is basically a group of citizens that are summoned by the courts to help decide whether or not a person is guilty of a crime. Now, there's one type of court, and we'll go into this more towards the end of the unit, that is an exception to this, and that is juvenile courts. Juvenile courts, when they determine the guilt or innocence of a juvenile, they do not have a jury there. And a lot of that goes back to the need to protect that juvenile's privacy, okay? Because we don't want what a kid does when they're 12 to forever change their life unless it's really, really horrific, okay? Now, let's say the trial goes on, the person's found guilty, and that person who was found guilty feels like the trial wasn't fair for some reason. Well, at that point, they can do what's called an appeal. So basically, they go to a higher court and they say, like the Court of Appeals or the Georgia Supreme Court, and they say, hey, look, this part of my trial, my jury trial, I didn't think it was very fair. It wasn't done in accordance with the Constitution, whatever. All right. And then his lawyers, while that person's sitting in jail or on probation or whatever, will argue on that person's behalf, okay, to try to get either a new trial or the judgment thrown out of court completely, okay? There's two levels of appeals courts, or appellate courts is really what we call them, in Georgia. That is the Court of Appeals and the Georgia Supreme Court. Court of Appeals is like the first stop, okay? So let's say the trial's over, you want to appeal. The first court that's going to hear your appeal is the Court of Appeals. It's not very cleverly named. Let's say that court doesn't agree with you and denies your appeal and you're stuck in jail. Well, it's not over. You can file for another appeal, this time to an even higher court. And this one is called the Georgia Supreme Court. All right. So the Georgia Supreme Court really is like the top level appellate court for the state of Georgia. They are the ones that really are able to decide for everyone in Georgia exactly what the law means and how to apply it. Okay? Now, there's one weird sidebar to the Georgia Supreme Court and the appeals process. If you are somebody who is sentenced to death, so you're found guilty of, I believe it's capital murder or murder one or something, and you are sentenced to death, then your case is automatically referred to the Supreme Court, okay? The Georgia Supreme Court. Whether you want them to or not, they will relook at your case and make sure that everything was done fairly, because at the end of the day, the death penalty doesn't have takebacks, all right? All right, so that's a brief overview. We will go over it again as we go through this unit, what I just talked about. So if you're not 100% on it right now, that's okay. We will talk about it again. All right, but let's talk about this this table here. So you got trial courts here, juvenile courts, Court of Appeals, and the Georgia Supreme Court. So these are all different types of courts. So basically, trial courts, they're the only ones where you're going to have a jury. All right, so a group of citizens who decide whether or not somebody's guilty of a crime. Okay. The length of time that judges are able to be judges in Georgia before they have to run for re-election for trial courts and juvenile courts, that number is 4 years. So they got 4-year term length before they need to run for re-election. For the higher level courts, the Court of Appeals and the Georgia Supreme Court, that total is 6 years. Okay, so there you go. Every 6 years, they'll run for re-election. Now, I keep saying judges running for re-election. You may not have encountered that fact before, but just about every judge in Georgia is elected. Okay, this is in contrast. This is different than the federal government. In the federal government, judges are appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. Okay, but that's not what happens in Georgia. They are directly elected by the people. All right, next up is appellate or trial courts. We've kind of already hit on this a lot, but ultimately, trial courts, well, surprise, surprise, they are a trial court. Okay, they have juries. Same goes for juvenile courts. The difference I want to point out to you is that even though trial courts are obviously considered trial courts and juvenile courts are also considered trial courts, there is a difference between the two. And that is right here. Trial courts will have a jury, while juvenile courts will not. Right? Next up, number of justices. And I put X's through trial courts and juvenile courts because there's like hundreds of these judges all spread out all across the state. In fact, most counties in Georgia have their own special superior court, which is considered a trial court, with any number of judges being members of it. Okay. Now, that being said, the number of judges on the Court of Appeals and the Georgia Supreme Court, those like top tier, high level courts, they are limited. There's only 15 judges on the Court of Appeals and only 9 on the Georgia Supreme Court. Selection method, like I said, the vast majority of judges in Georgia are elected. The difference here is with juvenile courts, they are appointed. The reason that they're appointed is because juvenile justice is a real specialty type of law, and the judge needs to have some sort of training and expertise in that area. All right, so today's assignment is the questions right here. I've already talked about what an appeal is, so that's the first question right here. So again, an appeal is basically the trial happens. You feel like you were found guilty. You feel like something went wrong with the trial. You file an appeal with one of those higher courts, more than likely the Court of Appeals, and you're hoping that either you get a new trial or that your judgment is thrown out completely. Okay, but ultimately you file an appeal with a higher court because you feel like the trial was somehow unfair or not constitutional. All right, describe how the purpose of appellate courts is different than the purpose of trial courts. So the answer to this question is largely in the name. Trial courts, they have trials. All right, they determine guilt or innocence. Whereas appellate courts, they hear appeals. Okay, so the trial's already happened. The appellate court it's working out whether things happen fairly or not. What types of cases require the Supreme Court to review them? I already hit on that. If you didn't catch it, you can watch the video again, or you can go and do the reading. All right, and reread it. All right, y'all. Let's see here. That about covers it. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I will be doing office hours today from 1 to 1:30. All right. Look forward to seeing you there if you need some help. All right. Bye, y'all.